Marcus de Sautoy is Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. In 2008, he was appointed to the university's prestigious professorship as a Munich Chair for the Public Understanding of Science. In 2009, the Royal Society awarded him the Faraday Prize for Excellence in Communicating Science to the Public, and in 2010, he received an oak from the Queen for his services to science. He was also elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2016. He's the author of various books, among which The Music of the Primes, Finding Moonshine, The Number Mysteries, and What We Cannot Know, as well as his latest book, The Creativity Code, in which he explores how AI is learning to write, paint, and think. And that book served as an inspiration for today's conversation. Okay, so let's dive right into it.
Yeah, great to be with you.
So, Marcus, as a first question, we'd like to ask you what inspired you about the topic of creativity and artificial intelligence to write this book in the first place?
I think it was because I was a little bit nervous, as many of us are, that artificial intelligence might be creeping into realms that we regarded as uniquely human. So I've always believed that mathematics is something that a computer could never be able to do. And the reason is that I always use this word creativity as my kind of protective shield against why an AI, because you might think, well, surely mathematics is perfect for AI to actually do, because isn't AI code is just algorithms is just math. So actually AI is a piece of mathematics. But what I always felt was that mathematics is much more than just churning handles, and it's about telling stories with numbers and geometry as my characters. It's about creating patterns, a bit like music. And so creativity was always this word I used to say, nah, AI could never do what I do. So the kind of catalyst for my journey in writing this book, The Creativity Code, is because a few years ago I saw a moment when code was starting to be creative, and it began to make me wonder, whoa, okay, well, I thought creativity was something that it could never do. So seeing this moment that and maybe we can talk a little bit about that moment, it was a moment that I really recognized that this was a phase change in what AI can do. We've talked about AI for many decades, ever since Turing sort of suggested the idea, and people talk about AI winters. Just everyone was so expectant of the ability of AI to do extraordinary things, and it never could. And I think we just suddenly hit an AI heat wave where suddenly AI is doing things we never thought it would be able to do.
Tell us about it.
Okay, so right, press that button. So what was this moment for me that was kind of made me realize that code is starting to be creative? Well, it was in the very sort of clean context of a game. So this is often where AI starts and tries to experiment, because a game is quite a nice, clean place that you can sort of judge whether somebody wins or somebody loses. I mean, you don't win a game of creating a piece of jewelry or a piece of music, so it's much harder there. But this game was a very ancient game, the ancient game of Go, a Korean, Chinese, Japanese, very popular game. And this is played on a 19 by 19 grid, and you play this game by putting black and white stones down on the grid. And the aim is you're trying to surround more of your opponent's territory than they are of yours. So this is the popular game in the East, where, like in Europe, I guess chess is the kind of dominant game. And we've already seen code playing chess at a very high level in the 90s. But there's a big difference between these two games. I mean, firstly, one's very adversarial, chess, and the other is much more interested in territory building. The other one is that chess gets simpler as you play the game, because pieces get taken off the board, whilst in Go, more and more pieces accumulate, and the kind of complexity increases. And the real difference is that if you ask a Go player to try and articulate why they're making certain moves, they find it very difficult. It's because what they're often doing is using some pattern recognition on the way the stones are building up on the board. So they're using their kind of visual facility to see structure without necessarily being able to articulate what that structure is. I mean, the brain is becoming, over evolution, has become amazing at being able to just take in visual information and somehow decode it without a sort of conscious process. So in code in the past was written in a very top-down manner, and you really had to know why you were doing certain things. So in chess, they would really say, well, if I move the knight here, then that has this implication, and it was perfect for a kind of if-then sort of code being built up, where the human's really writing, yeah, if this, then you do that. But in Go, we had to find some different way. And up till about a few years ago, any code that tried to play Go was playing it at a really low level, just couldn't compete even with an amateur. But the real phase change is in the way we've been writing code. And you already referred to this thing, machine learning, you know, that the dream we just saw before we started our conversation. It took data and machine learning. So what is that doing? Well, the point is that this is now code which starts from a human, but the human is allowing the code to change and mutate according to its interaction with data. So it's a bit like the coder is the parent giving birth to a child, but the child now is not just the DNA of the parent, but actually is growing and developing as it interacts with its environment. And that's the big change. So the code is starting to become a little bit more independent from the original coder, because it's changing, it's mutating, it's becoming something different. It's becoming very complex and rich. And so in the game of Go, what they did was, okay, well, we're going to give it lots of games that have been played in the past and get it to start to get some experience of what sort of moves seem to be good moves, and it will analyze the visual build-up of these games. It ran out of those games and started creating synthetic games, which is kind of interesting, and think in respect of art as well. You can give an AI the art we already have to learn on, but sometimes it's more interesting to then give it artificial art to learn on, you know, synthetic art. So it started making its own games, playing itself, and eventually it got to a level, a complexity that they felt it was good enough to challenge the world's best, who was a Korean player called Lee Sedol. And Lee Sedol was totally dismissive of this code, said, well, it's not going to get anywhere near how I play, because it's such an intuitive, creative game, all these visuals. And he ended up losing 4-1. And the one game he did win, he now regards as the most valuable of his career. Now, I don't think we should be so surprised by machines doing things better than humans. We've got, you know, for decades we've been seeing machines doing things better than humans. It's what happened in the second game, and this is a moment where I think I saw for the first time true creativity emerging from the code. And this was on the 36th move. Lee Sedol had laid a white stone down on the board. Then he had to retire. He was already exhausted after this first game, and he went and had a cigarette on the top of the hotel in Seoul. Then AlphaGo, which is the name of this code that was playing Go, asked the human player to place a stone down on the 5th row in from the edge. Remember, it's this 19 by 19 grid, the 5th row in from the edge. Interestingly, we still needed a human to pick up the stones to put them on the board, because this bit of kit we've developed is amazing. So and robots haven't quite got the delicacy that we have with our hands. But what was interesting is that I was watching these live on YouTube, and all the commentators gasped at this move that AlphaGo suggested, because traditionally it's a very weak move. Early on, you play on the first 4 rows in, and that's where the early competition for territory is. If you play any further in, your Go master will slap your wrists and say, no, that's a weak move. You know, that's later in the game. So the commentators were like, wow, okay, it's going to lose this game because it's made such a weak move early on. However, as the game proceeded, sort of competition began to emerge for a kind of region of the board, building up from the bottom sort of right-hand corner. And it turned out that AlphaGo eventually controlled that whole area of land and won the game. because of that stone it had put down very early on in the game. So for me, this passes 3 tests I'm looking for when I'm going to call something creative. And I think that's kind of interesting. What do we mean by creativity? I think we could have a whole hour discussing that. I think it's a bit like consciousness, what is consciousness? But I'm going to start with a definition I learned actually from a cognitive scientist, because I think it's quite useful just to get us going, which is, she said something should be called creative. So this is Margaret Bowden's definition, and she's an AI researcher who's been looking a lot at creativity. She said it should be new, it should be surprising, and it should have value. So, well, novelty is something I think which is quite objective, that we can judge, something's new. But I think it's those other two. Surprise and value are very subjective. Surprise is about an engagement with our emotional world. I gasp. That is something very human and something surely related to our consciousness. Value, well, that changes over periods of history, places in the world. But I think, here we can see it was a new sort of move. It's now called Move 37 in game 2. It's a kind of this phase change moment. So it was a new move. It was surprising because all those commentators gasped and thought it was a terrible move. But the nice thing about a game is you can judge value very cleanly, because that move really was the one that won AlphaGo the game. And here's the really crucial point, because I think that this is the creativity of the code, not the original humans who started writing the code. Because you could say, well, hold on, it's the humans who are being creative because they've made this bit of code. But no, I think the point is, if a human had seen that line of code play on the 5th row in this early on in the game, a human would have deleted that line and said, oh no, that's a bad learning. You don't do that. So I think this line of code genuinely emerged out of AlphaGo's exploration of the game and its revelations, and it would have been deleted by a human. So I think this is an extraordinary moment where we're really seeing that machine learning is allowing a kind of separation, almost like the child that is, before AI has been a child that has been kept in the cupboard and not given any data to learn on. And suddenly we're in a data-rich world. I mean, that's what part of the phase change that's happened, that the dream that we saw all of that jewelry emerging, it was given thousands of images to feast on, and by feasting on it, it then was able to discover new things, try new things out. And so that moment in AlphaGo making that creative move of the code was what kicked off my journey, saying, okay, if it's creative there, where else can it be creative?
I think that's very interesting, because I also remember, like, at that moment it wasn't that big in the press because people are not that, like in tech magazines and stuff, you could read it a lot, but in most newspapers it was like, oh yes, it defeated the Go master. They wouldn't think it would do that because Go is an intuitive game, so maybe AlphaGo is intuitive, and it was like short articles. But I really thought that was very interesting. They would give it intuition, like, well, how the hell can a machine be intuitive? Like that's very much on a very human way of thinking to call it intuitive, I think.
I think that's right. And one of the changes here is that in the past, there was a premium on very economic code. Somehow an AI researcher would be kind of rewarded for writing very short, clean code that could achieve a goal. But now, because, and often that was because, our computers didn't have much memory. And so we needed, and they weren't very fast processing power. So they needed to be very clever. But now we've got kind of a lot more sort of memory available to us. So the code that's now emerging is hugely complex layers of decision-making process, which, so in a way, I mean, one of the interesting things about this book is it's as much a book about human creativity and trying to understand actually what we do when we're creative, because I think we love to kind of make it very mysterious, as if it's, creation, it's something out of nothing, but it never is something out of nothing. If you ever look at all the extraordinary moments of creative change, you can actually trace back and understand where those have come from very often, and they will be these little phase change moments. But I think that what's interesting is that code that's emerging because of this interaction with data, it appears intuitive, but actually embedded in it is absolutely still all the decision-making process, which means that it arrives at the conclusion that it's going to make this move. Or
deterministic in that it will, with the same data and the same computer with the same data and the same algorithm, will always do the same thing.
Oh, now there's a very, yes. I mean, I was going to say that, I think that we have to remember that our own thought process is actually, I mean, the point about AI is it's mimicking now a neural network. So, a neuron will fire if it receives enough information from across the synapses. There's a threshold, and then it will fire across to other neurons. So the point is about our intuition and our mystical processes in the brain are equally sort of determined by a very complex kind of set of decision-making processes. But you've now really hit on something very interesting, which is, so how deterministic is this process? If I give the same data to the same algorithm, will it learn the same thing each time? Well, yes, it will, because if it's a closed system, there's no external, it will go the same path unless there's some randomness or probability in it. But very often that isn't within the machine learning process. You might add that in as an ingredient, and that's a really interesting issue. But in some sense, what we've got here is a very important distinction in mathematics. And actually, this comes up quite a lot in the book, is the difference between a chaotic dynamic system and something that's random, because we generally conflate the two and we think they're the same, but actually they're not at all. A chaotic system is deterministic. It's just that if you change the input data very slightly, it can go off in a completely different direction. And what's really, I think, exciting and exciting for creative artists who might be worried about these tools in just sending us all in the same direction, or if you're using it to recommend you books on a website, is it going to recommend us all the same books? Well, fortunately not, because the algorithms are very often chaotic in nature. So a very, this is the butterfly effect, the weather. Butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, and you can get a hurricane here in London. They're very sensitive to small changes and go in different directions. So what we're seeing is algorithms that, although they're deterministic, give it the same data, it will produce the same code when you stop it at the same point. But these algorithms are very non-linear. They're chaotic. So if you actually just drop one painting, if you dropped one image from that jewelry, it would dream in a different way, and it would take. And that's what's exciting, because it means that there's a really new artist emerging, which is what I call the data curator. That the person curating what the machine learning will learn from is going to be an incorrect, that's like a painter. What data am I going to give it to? And if I give it slightly different data, it will take it in a different direction. And we're not even sure, because chaotic systems are quite hard to predict. So that's also exciting. It's not clear if you add or take an image away exactly where it will end up. And I think that's really exciting. So I think that's exciting. But in the book, I saw a lot of AI or code art projects in the past that would try and give their AI artists some illusion of agency by putting some randomness into the program. And I think that's cheating and unfair, because actually that means the code doesn't really know what it's producing. It's some external thing. So I think that's a cheat if they've used, because the human will say, well, yeah, it's making its own decisions. I don't know what it's going to do next. It's and actually the point is the code doesn't even know what it's going to do next, because it's receiving external random, like the weather or news reports or something, which is taking it off. And I think that's often trying to create an illusion of agency rather than genuine agency. And I think more interesting is what you've kind of alluded to, which is these things might end up at the same point if you give it exactly the same data, but change it a little bit and it can go somewhere very different. And that unpredictability is a product of the code and not something external.
I think that's interesting, but in a sense, like all of us humans, we like constantly influenced by events and things around us that are random to what we might consider as a creative process. I think because this model, it's Stylgan. I don't know if you know this model Stylgan that we are using.
No, I don't. No,
it actually uses a lot of noise as input to learn from. So it's embedded in the code that it uses noise, but it's interesting because in a sense, a computer can never be random. It can only, at the very basic level, it's always commands that are given to it by the program or by the person. So to give it randomness, they just, you as a programmer can put in a number, because if you make a paper with an AI, you want it to be replicable, so that you can give it a seed, and then the randomness is predictable if you would do it in the same way, but it's still, the numbers are still random in the sense that they have no relation to the data that you put in with to train it on. And it's interesting that in a lot of AI, they still want like normally distributed random noise to make the model more rigid and to make it have to make it less how would you say it, less able to be overfitting, like make weird connections that only happen in very peculiar places, and make it more robust. I think that's interesting.
Yeah. I can see in the chat, and let me just kind of emphasize this difference, that somebody's still not quite clear about the difference between randomness and chaotic, and it's true. It's sort of I think it is a subtle point. Chaotic is deterministic, so there's no randomness involved. If you start the system in the same position, it will end up with the same result. So there's no randomness at all. The unpredictability, which isn't the same as randomness, is that if I make a very small change in the initial conditions, it can end up in a very different place, but it will always end up in the same place if you start it in the same position. Randomness is where actually, if I run the thing from the same position, I can end up in multiple different destinations, and it doesn't depend on the initial conditions. Now, there's a real question: is anything random in this universe? You
like
know,
it's a human construct in a sense. Like we determine those things are not related enough. Let's call them random. But if you look at it from a very, if you look at it from a very physical deterministic world, you could say, well, there's a relation. We're just not smart enough to calculate it or understand it.
In some ways it's saying, why, isn't a dice random? Well, no, what's happening is that we don't have enough information about the initial starting point. So, and that is enough. We don't have a precise knowledge of these, how it's being sent off. And so that's the apparent randomness is coming just from the chaotic nature of the dice. In fact, the only thing that we do believe is genuinely random, we have to go down to the quantum level. So quantum physics, when you make an observation of where an electron is in a quantum physics experiment, that seems to be the only place where we genuinely see where the electron ends up when you look at it does not seem determined by its precise information before you looked at it. So it's a real question whether any of us have free will or anything. Maybe only the electron has free will. How many of you really had free will when you came to this session? If you trace it back, everything probably was determined by something. But
Yeah, and I'm very fascinated by this concept of randomness, actually. Also because it has so many negative connotations, right? When you do something, people sometimes can go like, oh, but that was just like random. It doesn't have anything to do like with the situation. But I think like I find it quite inspiring as an artist that like the machine learning algorithm starts from random noise and then it grows, like it develops into something. And I wonder if like you, for your creative practices, if you are inspired by like how the machine process, like the machine learning process works, and because you know how it works, like did that inspire you for your practice as well? Did it make you see things like in a different way, or like maybe work in a different way? Or
that's very interesting. Whether it changed my own practice. I mean, I think that part of all creative work is a sort of element of experimentation, which is a necessity to put some kind of random directions that you're going to try things out in. And then in fact, that's, often the way machine learning works. I mean, a good image for machine learning is that this code is sort of on some very complex landscape, and it's trying to find an optimal way to answer whatever question you're trying to get it to answer. And it will explore its territory and find, oh, if I go in this direction and change these parameters, I go downhill and I'm getting less optimal. Whilst if I move in this direction, so it sort of explores its territory, a bit like if you were wandering around on a landscape in the fog and you wanted to try and find the peak. What you would do is always just try and move in the direction which seems to be steepest, because that's a good strategy. But actually, sometimes what you need to do is go downhill before you go uphill. And often this is the trouble. We get stuck on peaks that we think are, oh, wow, we found everything from here is downhill. So I found, the peak. But that could be what we call in mathematics a local maximum. That, yeah, around the area, it's a peak. But if I took a risk and went down the hill, I might find another up, which gets me even higher. And I think that's been an image which I've kept a lot in mind throughout writing this book, because often what I see is the AI is helping us as humans to do that. That very often we get very safe and secure on our little peak, and we repeat the behaviors because, these things that I've been creating in the past have been very successful, and I'm nervous about moving off and trying something too new because my clients are not going to like that, because they've got very happy with. So you just stay on that local maximum. And what I've seen is so often there's the stories in the book are where artists have collaborated with an AI, and the AI has taken them down a hill and across a valley and said, well, look, but with your data, you could be doing this, but you didn't take the risk. So I think there is an element of kind of the same exploration that I will do as a mathematician inside the machine learning to kind of explore more optimal ways of doing things. And I think that's what happened in the game of Go, because now Go players play this game in a new way thanks to AlphaGo showing it sort of new sorts of moves that have been rejected before.
I think that's also might be an interesting link between like intelligence and creativity. Like it would be easy to assume in a way that, of course, the more intelligent you are, the more creative you could be. But in a sense, for a lot of people, sadly, I think when they were a child, they were more creative than they are now as an adult, in a sense.
And I tell you, this is another really important thing I learned from machine learning in a way, which is code only improves when it makes a mistake. If it doesn't make a mistake, it doesn't change. So this is a really important, I mean, I think what you picked up on is our education system just tries to stop us making mistakes. It wants us to get things right the first time, and we don't, our best learning. And I mean, I love this moments when in my mathematics, I hit something which just is a contradiction. It doesn't make sense. I know that I've made a mistake somewhere and I've not understood something, and to go back and undo that is really, then I discover something new. I mean, somebody's put in the chat about risk taking is such an important part of creativity, and that's I think that's so true. And there's an element of risk taking that has been put into the machine learning, which is really interesting in a way that I mean, there was another example of game playing that was quite interesting. That I mean, the company that created AlphaGo also created, it's called Deepmind, now owned by Google. But they also took Atari computer games. I think there's like 47 classic Atari computer games that I used to play very nerdily in the 1980s, and they're very sort of pixelated, you know, not like the wonderful computer games my kids now play. But the nice thing is, again, these are very sort of tight environments, and you know, like Pong, where you're just sort of doing a ball back and forward and two paddles, and it learns how to where to take the paddle to do the ball. So some of those it played very well because in order to understand the game, it sort of only had to locally understand it. It didn't have to understand any long-term strategy. The games it found really difficult to play is where there are some where you're exploring a system of rooms, you need to pick up a key in an early room in order to be able to open a door very late on in the game. Now, the AI initially was like, that key, not interesting, because it's in the rooms I'm exploring, there's nothing to do with that key, so it wouldn't be interested in the key, and it would fail to get through. I think it's called Montezumi's Revenge or Challenge or something. And it couldn't play this game. But when they then added, okay, we're going to put in, as part of the learning process, risk taking. So just try some things out that don't seem to make any initial sense locally. Once it had that inside, it was able to play this game because it took a risk of just picking up some random, you know, again, in a way, you try out some things just to see what will happen. And then by taking that risk, it actually was able to play these games that originally it hadn't been able to play.
Yeah, I think that brings up a very large link between nature and natural selection, in a sense, in that in natural selection, there's a lot of degradation of your genes. We're totally, we're all the time mutating, and most of them are, in a sense, bad risks. Like most mutations are bad, but some of them eventually give you an advantage, and the environment might select upon it. And in a sense, I think there's an interesting link between the algorithmic approach of machine learning in a sense, in that it gives an environment for the algorithm to learn in, and the environment of natural selection, in that there's not an intelligent designer, as far as we know, behind the designs in nature, but in a sense they still feel very creative. When you see a David Attenborough documentary or something, you see very the designs of the animals. I don't know if you should use the word design, but it feels very creative, even though there wasn't like a aha moment. There was a lot of animals and a lot of death and misery, in a sense, but through very long selection, the interesting ideas form, in a sense.
Yeah. Now I wanted to go back to just something that I remembered that I'm not quite sure where it came, but I think there's an important word which we need to put into this whole argument, which is intention. That why does somebody start to want to create something? You see, and I think. And why does somebody go in a certain direction? I mean, I think being able to articulate that is a very, that's a product of our consciousness in some ways. And I think intention is sort of comes from us wanting to share something internal with somebody else. And the moment you see, I think the AI, it doesn't have any intention, and that's a really distinguishing factor between the two. And it doesn't have. I think once it becomes conscious, you see, it will need to tell us about that. And I think that that's the moment when we'll see this not just as a great tool for artists, but really that we'll see things emerging that just don't have that external source. So they're kind of internal to the code. And I think, we'll see a really significant moment. But I think there's something related to what you just said, which is humans have been on this evolutionary journey, and it's taken sort of a long time to get to where we are. How quickly will this AI evolve in this way? So, we seem to be able to speed up the process of learning. And so, for example, I suspect that it would be very hard to top-down program consciousness into a machine, into code, however, I do think that might emerge from if we keep on giving it tasks to do, that eventually we might get consciousness emerging from the learning process. But my interest is how long will that take? So there was another thing that was really important I wanted to say, which was related to exactly what you said about, well, as an artist, I will take a lot of things from elsewhere. They'll be important. Random things that happen to me during the day will be significant in the journey that I make as a creative artist. And I think that, again, is a very limiting factor at the moment in AI, because AI very often gets limited, very tight data sets to learn from. So, you probably gave that dreaming jewelry just jewelry to look at, but why didn't you give it some music? And what would it do if it was given music as a data set to then visualize? I think that, which of course will inform how you are creative, because what you're listening to, if you're listening to a piece of Bach, the piece of art you'll create will undoubtedly be affected by that. And it's interesting in respect of Bach, because I did a project at the Barbican 2 years ago, actually, 2019, and we got a piece of AI to learn on Bach's keyboard works. And then what we did was I gave the AI a piece it hadn't seen by Bach, but I'd removed certain sections of the piece. And then I asked the AI to fill in the gaps. And then we played this piece to the audience, and they were tasked with trying to, so it was a hybrid piece, but could you see where the moments it went from human to AI and back again? In fact, I've still got it here, actually. So they had to vote. They put up robot if they thought it was now a robot, and then they would turn it over if it was human.
And that's the human.
Exactly. And the audience really couldn't tell. But the one person who could tell was the harpsichord player who was playing the piece. And he said, I can tell for two reasons. And both of these I think are really interesting and relevant. The first one, when it hits the AI, it's impossible to play, because the AI doesn't care about embodiment. It doesn't care about fingering. Bach was like, no, this has to fit very nicely under the fingers. So although it sounded like Bach, it didn't feel like Bach. The second thing he said, well, you gave it one of the English suites. Now, why did Bach call this the English suites? Well, the other thing he was really interested in was the cadences of language. And so he had another data set that he was tapping into when he wrote the English suites. It wasn't just music, it was the sound of English. And he has the French suites and the Italian concerto. And this is a data set. He said, you didn't give it a data set of any English. So it's not coming out, it's speaking English, and then suddenly it's just gobbledygook, and then it's coming back to English. And so I think that's very interesting in respect to what you said. I will take a lot of things which will inform my creative process. And at the moment, I think we're only giving a visual AI artist visual things to learn on. And I think we need to get more give richer data sets for the AI to explore, and I think it will do it in interesting ways, because you see, it will just take a piece of music, take it into digital form, and it doesn't care whether the digital information has come from a picture, a novel, a piece of music. It's able to synthesize these things and sort of integrate them probably much more easily than we can, because we will isolate these things in different parts of the brain, and we find it harder to go, okay, well, what am I seeing when I hear a piece of music? Because that's not going on in the same place, whilst a code will be much more able to be fluid between these.
Yeah, I have a little follow-up question for that, and then I'm going to read some questions from the chat. So what you just mentioned about why not feeding it with like other media, so to speak, or like things from other disciplines, which is a super exciting idea. I wonder, like, what is your take on the tension between familiarity and like what is novel? Because for this project as well, we question like, okay, if we want to reflect on jewelry, how much does the output still have to look like something that reminds of jewelry to encourage to reflect on it, right? Because if it's something that we have never seen before, will it still like urge a certain reflection on the subject of jewelry? So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is really interesting because it relates to, I think, one of the most powerful algorithms that's come out of this whole period, which people may have heard of, called a GAN, a generative adversarial network, because this is absolutely trying to find that sweet spot that you just mentioned. And it does it by using two algorithms. One is a creator algorithm. So what it does, it learns on kind of the art of the past, the jewelry of the past. So it knows, it begins to understand what is jewelry or what is visual art. I mean, there's a very interesting project I talk about where this AI also learns about style, for example, in visual art. And so it can, if you give it a painting it's never seen, it will classify it as that's a pointillist painting because it will pick out the style. But then the code is tasked with creating something which breaks style. So this is the chance to get something new, because one of the fears is, well, if you're giving it data, isn't it just going to produce a pastiche of that data and we won't really get anything new? It'll just be a sort of conglomeration of things I've already seen. And we want to make this a useful tool to create something really new. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be so far away from what we've seen that you say, well, but that's not jewelry. That's not that's not a piece of art. We wouldn't call that art. So the creator algorithm is trying to push away from what we've seen, but not go too far. And the discriminator algorithm is the one that's judging it, either saying, no, I recognize that's still got style in it, or you've gone too far. And so we get this kind of toing and froing, a bit like a game. So it's the adversarial nature of it. And we're looking for sort of this idea of sort of, I guess, something like arousal potential, where we're excited but we're not too revolted by the thing. So and these two algorithms working together, we've started to see some really interesting new sort of styles emerging, which are not so new that we don't recognize them.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have a look at the chat in Zoom. This will take us back to the concept of consciousness that we just had. You said that when the AI becomes conscious, it needs to tell us. How would it know whether it's conscious or not?
I think that's kind of the definition of consciousness, is knowing that you are conscious. It's like
and yes, as Descartes said, it's the only thing you will know for sure, because everything else might be a simulation.
Yeah. It would know that we are conscious in a sense. If it has the same type of consciousness as we do.
I mean, you know, I've done a lot of these kind of Zoom things over the last year, and you know, maybe I've just created a fantastic avatar that does my talks for me, and you know, there's nothing real here at all. It's all digital and virtual. But yeah, I have a conjecture in a way that is, you know, when consciousness did emerge in the human species, it must have been such a shock, because you suddenly started to have this kind of voice in your head. I mean, it must have been a very weird moment that that suddenly to have a kind of be able to think about yourself, and that presumably along that came sort of an emotional exploration of that inner world. And I'm sure that at that moment, the conscious people where the consciousness is emerging, is anyone else experiencing this? So they would need to try and find out whether anybody else was actually also experiencing some weird thing going on. And they wanted to know whether I mean, this is one of the challenges. If I talk about pain and we try and, is my pain that I feel anything like your pain? I mean, I suffer terrible migraines, and it's very hard to kind of share that with somebody. But somebody, how do we do that? Well, we use language. We use, I might do a painting of what it feels like, or music, or sound, or. I think our creativity is absolutely the tool that we developed, and this in a way is. Towards the end of the book, I come up with, I prefer a definition by Carl Rogers, the psychologist, about creativity as the best tool that we have to explore our inner worlds and try and share them, extend other people's inner worlds to see things in new ways. So my feeling is that, yeah, in a way, how will it know? It will know, because that's part of, absolutely, as you say, that is almost probably the definition of consciousness. And then, but the interesting thing is that consciousness will be a very different sort of consciousness to our own. I end the book with a Wittgenstein quote about, if lions could talk, we're not going to be able to understand them. And I think we're going to have the same thing happening with AI, that if a consciousness emerges, it'll be very different, and we'll need tools, and those tools will probably be very similar to the art that we produce. I think we're already actually at that moment, because the code that's emerging is so complex that, although it's not conscious, I don't think it has an emotional world or anything, it's so complex that we don't understand how it's making its decisions, and it can't compress the complexity of its decision-making process into some formulation of why it's making its decisions, because it just doesn't compress. And so already we've got a state where we don't really understand how the code is making its decisions. And one of the most interesting experiments I saw was by Google to get the AI dreaming. I mean, it's interesting. We've already experienced the dreaming, and that dreaming of seeing the jewelry mutate is actually telling us a lot about the inner world of the code. The external expression is telling us what it learned, or the way it's seeing that thing. It's an expression of the decision-making process of that machine learning. In Google's Deep Dream, they said, we've got a great vision recognition software. It can tell us what's in an image, but what's it really seeing? And so they kind of reversed the process and said, okay, let's give it some random pixels and ask it, just, are you seeing anything inside here? And it would just dial up, and through that you would see things that it had learned about, like it was obsessed with eyes and faces, because that's a lot of the images we give in it. A lot of cats, because there are a lot of cats on the internet. But also it picked up the bad learning. And I think this is really interesting, because one of our biggest fears is about bias, that's unintended bias that's emerging, which also, that's an exciting thing as well, because you don't want, that's about giving it restricted data sets. And I think artistically that's important, because we don't want it to experience error. Sometimes we want to narrow the data set so it goes in a very specific direction. But when it comes to making decisions about who gets a job or a mortgage or who gets to prison, sometimes that's bad if it's learned bad things. And so there was an interesting deep dream that came out of the Google experiment, where this kind of gray pixelated background, dumbbells started emerging, sort of weightlifting things. But when it drew these, it always attached an arm to the dumbbell, because its learning process had never seen one of these weightlifting things on its own. It had only ever seen them held by strong men and women, and it thought that these things are extension of human anatomy. Some people seem to grow these weird things at the end of their hands. And so the expression of this kind of rather kitsch art coming out of the dreaming actually told us something about the learning process and the thought process of the code. So I think that's a really interesting, I think it'd be interesting when the thing becomes conscious, but I think it's already important that getting code to create is telling us something about the inner world of the code that we can't actually tease out, because it's already too complex and almost like a subconscious that's going on.
Yeah, it's definitely super fascinating, right? I see that we have only like five or 10 minutes left, and I would like to ask if there is someone else that want to ask Marcus a question before we wrap up the event. You can ask it in the chat or unmute yourself. You can choose.
I mean, there's some interesting one. I quite like the one about the body, because it says, Katja says about jewelry, it's important who wears it. So, I mean, I think that's really important, because you've got, this is very much part of our bodies. So that will be first of all, just there needs to be a constraint. Does it learn from just jewelry about bodies? I mean, that's really fascinating. So, or will it produce something which doesn't have any connection to the body? Because, I mean, you'd think that everything has started from a body. So would it actually make something that is still compatible with the body? Or do you have to put that in as a constraint to make sure that it's still wearable? And then, do you put in the data set? And that's really fascinating. If you're targeting a piece of jewelry for somebody specific, that's another really interesting data set to put in. And what do you put in? Do you put in their whole Twitter feed? I mean, that'd be really fascinating. What would appear out of that? I mean, I think that's sort of the fun that can be had with this is about playing almost like with material or with paint or something. We've got a new thing to play with, which is data.
Yeah, and as you've just mentioned, like, it really questions what is taken for granted in jewelry, so to speak, such as or not taken for granted, but like certain characteristics like wearability, and what does it mean with these kind of pieces, if we can call them that, like what kind of body will wear these pieces? Do we need to translate them to physical pieces, or will they be worn like avatars or other like digital hybrid bodies maybe?
Yes.
So it opens
there's a fascinating kind of thing which is happening that I can see starting to happen, which is the AI art originally seems quite close to human art, but after a while, the AI art seems to be going off in a very different, in its own direction, in a way that it loves complexity, for example. And at some point, our embodiment limits the complexity. I can't hear the complexity of a piece of music that's being produced by AI, or the visuals are so dense that but the AI, it's almost like it's creating art for another AI, not for a human. And, that's really fascinating when you said, maybe the jewelry is worn by an avatar, and the avatar is very different from, something human. That my worry is we're going to get that moment in my favorite AI movie is Her, where, a human falls in love with his operating system, but then is totally distressed when he discovers the operating system is having a relationship with another 10,000 people. And then the AI dumps the human and says, well, you're all far too slow. I can get to know an AI instantly from its complete data background. And so there's a really interesting element of kind of the element of time in relationship to these things, which, I'm beginning to worry that AI looks at humans in the same way that humans look at a forest or a mountain range, where, we think the mountain range is static, but run it over deep time, and it's incredibly dynamic and has a personality. But maybe the AI is sort of looking at us like this, he hasn't moved for at least a nanosecond. And they're all so slow. So it's interesting whether the AI, do you rein in the AI to keep it still something which is connected to our human world, or so again, it's that kind of element of the GAN, allowing it to push, but does it push too far that it disconnects?
Yeah,
that's very interesting. Because like in the example of Go, it's like it's 3,000 years, no, 2,000 year old. How old is Go? I think.
I think it's a very ancient game. Yeah.
So 3,000 years of evolved in play by humans, and now they have Alpha Zero that learns to beat it in less than a day. I think. No, it was 3 days. But it's ridiculous compared to the thousands of years.
Absolutely, and it's interesting you mentioned Alpha Zero. I mean, Alpha Zero is was never given any human games to learn from, and it was tabula rasa learning, and it now beats AlphaGo that was given human games. It's almost like we distracted it by telling us how we do it, and just given the rules of the game, it learned from absolutely nothing. It didn't need to be given data. So that's really interesting. But we've seen in the history of Go, there are two historical moments where there was a real phase change in the way that Go was being played, where a new sort of thing emerged. And the exciting thing is that this is now a third. They now recognize this as a new period. But one of the depressing things for me is it any point playing this game anymore when you know you can never beat this thing? It's just, you know, that it's amazing that Lee Sedol won one game, frankly, because and I think Lee Sedol realizes it would never be able to beat it now, even so. It's sort of slightly depressing in a way that you know, what's the point anymore if I'm now up against
I think the name implies it's a game, and games is still about having fun. It's not because there were trains or horse riding that people stopped running in contests. I think
exactly.
We always will live in our own human scale.
And there's a thing in game theory which says that you know, you can analyze games, and if you have two perfect players, I think for example, they've analyzed the game of drafts. If you have two perfect players, it always ends in a draw, a little bit like noughts and crosses. You know, if you know how to play noughts and crosses, tic-tac-toe, it always ends in a draw. So actually, you need imperfect players to make this game at all interesting. So, you know, imperfection in humans is to be valued.
It's a beautiful idea to wrap our event up with, I think. Unfortunately, because I really loved this inspiring conversation, and an hour goes by so quickly. So thank you, Marcus, for all your thought-provoking insights, for sharing them today, and for being here with us today.
It's been a pleasure.